Revenge tales present the stories we tell ourselves about justice. We've all felt it, that hot, clarifying rage when someone wrongs us. The fantasy that plays out in perfect detail. What we'd say, what we'd do, how their face would look when they finally understood what they'd done. Revenge stories appeal to something primal in us, something that predates civilization and morality. They promise a world where the scales balance, where the guilty suffer proportionally to the pain they've caused, where justice isn't an abstract concept but a tangible, satisfying reality we can hold in our hands. But here's what those fantasies don't show us: what happens after. This collection exists because most revenge narratives lie to us. They end at the moment of triumph, the villain exposed, the hero vindicated, credits rolling before we see what comes next. They offer catharsis without cost, transformation without loss. They let us believe that revenge is a surgical strike that removes only the tumor, leaving everything else intact. These stories are different. They're morally honest. The narratives in revenge tales don't glorify revenge or offer the satisfaction you might expect. Instead, they explore what revenge actually does, not to its targets, but to the people who pursue it. They examine the collateral damage, the relationships destroyed, the parts of ourselves we sacrifice in the name of justice. They ask uncomfortable questions. What does it cost to become the kind of person who can methodically destroy another human being? What do we lose when we let rage refine us into instruments of retribution? And most troubling of all, what happens when we get exactly what we wanted and discover it wasn't enough? The Unraveling opens this collection because it captures the central truth we'll return to again and again. Revenge transforms the avenger more profoundly than it ever transforms the target. In this story, a young professional discovers that her father, the man she trusted most, spent years systematically sabotaging her career to prevent her from outshining him. What she uncovers isn't a single betrayal, but a decades-long pattern of crushing talented people to maintain his own superiority. So she does what any of us might fantasize about. She documents everything, builds an airtight case, and orchestrates his complete professional destruction. She wins. And in winning, she loses everything that made her worth saving. What follows is not a story of triumph. It's a story of what we become when we let revenge consume us, how it hollows us out, rewrites our relationships, transforms us into people we no longer recognize. It's about the moment you realize that destroying your enemy didn't heal you. It just made the world smaller and darker, with you standing alone in the wreckage. If you're looking for catharsis, you won't find it here. But if you're looking for truth, the kind that sits heavy in your chest and makes you question what justice actually means, then turn the page. Let's begin with a daughter, a father, and the terrible mathematics of revenge. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. They don't tell you that by the time you've chilled it to perfection, you won't recognize your own hands serving it. I used to be someone else. Someone who believed in fairness, in hard work, in the idea that talent and dedication would eventually be rewarded. Someone who loved her father without reservation, who sat at Sunday dinners and felt grateful for the life she'd been given. That person is gone now. In her place is someone who knows exactly how many emails it takes to destroy a man's reputation. Someone who can smile across a dinner table while scheduling the precise moment his world will collapse. Someone who understands that the worst betrayals don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, year after year, until the weight of them rewrites your entire history. I got my revenge. I won. And in winning, I lost everything that made me worth saving. This is the story of how I unraveled my father's life, and my own in the process. The email sat in my inbox for 3 days before I opened it. Subject: Congratulations on the interview, Marcus Chun. My hands trembled as I read it. Marcus Chun, a junior account executive at Sterling and Associates, was thanking me for bringing the opportunity to his attention. It was polite, professional. It was also a knife in the chest. I'd been promised the senior position. My father had introduced me to the partner, one of his oldest friends, and walked out of that lunch absolutely certain. "It's yours," he'd said, squeezing my shoulder in that confident way fathers do when they're certain they've solved their child's problems. "Trust me, I've known Robert for 20 years. But the rejection from Sterling had come 3 days ago. A polite phone call from Robert himself, saying they'd gone another direction, that they hoped I'd understand, that sometimes these things just don't work out. Now I understood. It had worked out. Just not for me. I stared at Marcus Chen's name on the screen. I knew who he was. He'd been at the office holiday party 2 years ago, something my father had mentioned in passing. Ambitious. Good-looking. Networked. The kind of young professional fathers like mine loved to mentor. Publicly. My phone was in my hand before I'd consciously decided to call. Hi, honey. Everything okay? My father's voice came through warm and distracted. He was probably at his desk, probably finishing up some deal that would make him proud of himself all week. The Sterling job, I said. They hired Marcus Chen instead. A pause. I could almost see him stiffening, adjusting his expression in real time. Ah. Well, these things happen in recruitment. The pool is competitive. You told me I had it. I said I'd recommend you. There's a difference. His voice shifted, became careful. Lawyer-like. I can't control their final decision, sweetheart. You can't expect the world to hand things to you just because. Just because my father vouched for me? I finished. Just because you said you believed in me? That's not fair. What's not fair is lying. The silence stretched. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him calculating which version of himself to activate, which response would defuse this without admitting anything. Look, he said finally, I'm sure there will be other opportunities. You're capable, but maybe you need to manage your expectations a bit. Not everything is meant for everyone. I hung up. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I opened my laptop and fell into a kind of trance, my fingers moving across the keyboard with an autonomy I didn't question. Facebook messages between my father and Marcus's father. LinkedIn recommendations. An old email congratulating my dad on having an eye for talent, on knowing how to position people for success. But it was the deleted messages I recovered from an old backup that made my stomach drop. A conversation from 6 years ago when I'd been applying to graduate programs. She's smart, but I worry she's getting ahead of herself. Wants to go to Yale. I'm just not sure she's ready for that level of pressure. Might be better for her confidence if she stayed closer to home. Have you thought about what Marcus is doing next? My father had written that. To Marcus's father. About me. Yale had rejected me that year. I'd never known the real reason why. I'd told myself it was okay, that I wasn't meant for Ivy League, that I should adjust my expectations. I'd believed the narrative he'd been quietly constructing around me for years. I opened another browser window and began to search in earnest. 3 weeks of research revealed something I wish I hadn't found. It wasn't just me. There was a pattern, a clear, undeniable pattern that stretched back at least 15 years. My father was a senior partner at a prestigious firm, respected in his circles, known as a mentor to young professionals. But the young professionals he mentored publicly were rarely the ones he truly believed in. Those ones, the genuinely talented ones, he subtly sabotaged. A woman named Claire who'd worked at his firm 5 years ago had posted on Reddit about her experience. She'd been passed over for partnership 3 times, each time told she wasn't ready, each time watching as less experienced colleagues were promoted. She'd eventually left the industry entirely, heartbroken and convinced of her own inadequacy. Reading her account, I felt something crack inside me. That had been my experience, multiplied by dozens. There was a man named David who'd worked with my father at a nonprofit board. David had wanted to start his own initiative, something innovative. My father had offered to help him pitch it to donors. Instead, my father had pitched it first without crediting David and secured the funding. David had eventually learned the truth and confronted him. My father had simply denied it, and David's word against his had meant nothing. I found a LinkedIn profile of a young woman named Sophie, who'd been my father's mentee. She'd eventually become CEO of a successful startup. In an interview, she mentioned how her early mentor had actually been more of a cautionary tale. He taught me who not to become. She didn't name him, but I knew. There were others. So many others. And then I found the oldest ones, records from his college days, conflicts with classmates who'd complain that ideas were stolen, credit was misappropriated, opportunities were blocked. Even then, even when he was young, he'd been doing this. The realization came slowly, then all at once. My father was afraid of exceptional people. Not consciously, maybe, but on some fundamental level, he couldn't tolerate anyone shining brighter than him. And so he'd made it his life's work to dim other people's lights. And I was his daughter. In some twisted way, I'd been his greatest threat. The night I understood this, I called my therapist's emergency line. Dr. Reeves called me back within an hour. "I'm okay," I assured her, though I wasn't sure that was true. "I'm not in crisis. I need to tell you something." I spent 40 minutes on the phone reconstructing my entire life through this new lens. The times he'd discouraged me from applying to scholarships. "You'll seem arrogant if you self-promote like that." The debate tournaments where he'd expressed concern that I was getting too confident after wins. The moment in my senior year when he'd suggested that maybe I wasn't cut out for law school, my dream, and that I should consider something more realistic. He was sabotaging me, I said, hearing the words aloud for the first time. "On purpose." "Do you believe that?" Dr. Reeves asked carefully. "I know it. I have proof." We talked about what came next. She recommended we discuss this in our next regular session, suggested I give myself time to process before taking any action. She used words like painful realization and grief response and healthy boundaries. But I wasn't listening anymore, because underneath the shock and sadness was something else, something hot and focused: rage. I spent the next 3 months becoming someone I didn't recognize. By day, I was functional. I'd taken a leave of absence from work. Burnout, I told my boss, and it wasn't entirely a lie. But my real work happened at night, in the darkness of my apartment, illuminated by the glow of my laptop screen. I created a spreadsheet. I documented every incident I could find: dates, names, details. I reached out to Claire from Reddit, to David from the nonprofit, to Sophie and others. Some wouldn't respond. Some were cautious. But others had been waiting for years for someone to finally ask. I collected emails, screenshots, recovered deleted messages. I built a case like a prosecutor building a case, each piece of evidence another brick in the structure of his crimes. The hardest part wasn't the research. It was the family dinners. Every Sunday, I sat at that table with him. My mother, oblivious. My sister, who'd never had her own ambitions crushed and so had never understood why I'd become so distant. My father, who greeted me with the same warm smile, who asked about my time off, who suggested that maybe I was overthinking things and needed to move forward. One Sunday in October, my sister pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Are you mad at Dad?" she asked, arranging cheese on a board with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to doubt herself. "No," I said. And it was true. I wasn't angry anymore. I'd moved beyond anger into something colder, something more sustainable, something that could fuel me through the months ahead. "You're weird with him." "I'm just tired." She studied me for a moment, then shrugged. She had no framework for what I was experiencing. She'd never needed one. At the dinner table, my father made a toast. He talked about family, about loyalty, about how important it was to always have each other's backs. He looked directly at me when he said it, and I smiled, and I raised my glass, and I thought about all the ways he'd stabbed us in the back while smiling like this. The company gala was scheduled for November 15th. My father had been invited to speak on a panel about mentoring the next generation of leaders. The irony was so sharp, I almost laughed when I saw the agenda online. I didn't attend. Instead, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open, watching the clock, waiting for 7 p.m. to come and go. I'd scheduled the emails to send automatically at exactly 7:15, just as he was being introduced on stage. To 3 journalists he'd given interviews to his business partners, to the current head of HR, to board members, to his oldest friends, to his professional network. The emails contained a carefully written statement, clear and factual, detailing the pattern of sabotage. Attached were the documents, the recovered messages, the testimonies, the timeline of affected individuals. I'd included Claire's story, David's story, Sophie's story, and mine. I'd also included information about his affair, something I hadn't discovered through my investigation but which had been mentioned casually by one of his colleagues when I'd asked gentle questions. It felt like a gift, almost evidence that his personal integrity was as compromised as his professional ethics. At 7:18, my phone began to light up. Notifications. Emails. His number calling once, twice, then stopping. I watched from the window of my apartment as a story began to unfold in real time. LinkedIn posts questioning his credibility. News articles beginning to form. His business partner issuing a statement that they were investigating the allegations. His oldest friend, the one who'd apparently known about the affair, releasing a public statement about being disappointed in recent revelations. By the next morning, he'd been asked to resign. By the end of the week, 2 other women had come forward with their own stories. The scandal was no longer just about him. It was about a systemic problem in his firm, a culture of senior men protecting other senior men while sabotaging anyone with too much potential. He became the face of that problem. Exactly as I'd planned. The hollow feeling began immediately. I'd expected vindication. I'd imagined I'd feel powerful, righteous, justified. Instead, I felt like I was standing in the wreckage of something I destroyed, suddenly unsure if I was the architect or the casualty. My mother wouldn't speak to me. When I tried to explain, she shut down, her face closing like a door. "He's your father," she kept saying, as if that explained everything, as if that was a counterargument to evidence and testimony. My sister sent a long text about betrayal, about airing family problems publicly, about loyalty. She didn't ask for my side of the story. She'd already decided. Extended family split into camps. Some thought I was brave. Most thought I was cruel. At family events that I'd eventually have to attend, I would be the girl who destroyed her father's career. Never mind the years of sabotage. Never mind the women whose dreams he'd stolen. I was the villain in the narrative that people preferred. Because it was easier. Because there was something almost romantic about the idea of a successful older man brought down by an ungrateful child. It was a cleaner story than the truth. My father didn't contact me for 3 months. When he finally did, his voice was barely recognizable on the phone. "How could you do this?" He sounded broken in a way I'd never heard before. "To your own father? How could you do it to me?" I asked quietly. "For years. How could you do it to all of them?" He hung up. I never heard from him again. 6 months later, I was sitting in my apartment with a job offer letter from a firm across the country. It was a good offer. Competitive. Earned, not given. The sterling position had gone to someone else in the end. Not Marcus Chin, who'd eventually been fired for taking credit for other people's work. That made me smile darkly. My father had trained him well. But they didn't offer it to me either. My father's reputation, however deserved his fall had been connected to me. I was tainted by association. I'd burned my whole world down for revenge against a man who, in the end, wasn't worth the match. The apartment was dark. I looked around at the space where I'd spent months conducting an investigation that had destroyed my family, and I realized I couldn't even remember what I'd been so angry about anymore. Not the details, just the weight of it. There was a moment, a crystalline moment, where I understood that I'd become something I didn't recognize. Not a victim anymore, but not a victor either. Something darker. Something that had been shaped by rage and refined by months of cold calculation. The job offer was in Portland. I accepted it. I packed my things. I didn't say goodbye to anyone because there was no one left to say goodbye to. Sometimes I read articles about my father. He'd attempted a comeback at a smaller firm, but it hadn't taken. His reputation was permanently tarnished. Last I heard, he was doing consulting work, teaching a class at a university, positions where he could still exercise power without direct oversight. I'd taken away his influence. I hadn't taken away his ability to do damage. I'd just made it smaller. Was that enough? I still don't have an answer. Thank you for listening to Unraveling. I wrote this story because I wanted to explore something we don't talk about enough, the quiet devastation of revenge. We're drawn to stories of vindication, of wrongs being righted, of the powerful being brought down. But what happens after? What does victory taste like when you've burned everything to ash to achieve it? This story isn't really about a father's betrayal, though that's the catalyst. It's about how anger, when left to metastasize, can transform us into something we don't recognize. It's about the collateral damage of revenge, the family fractured, the relationships destroyed, the person we become in pursuit of justice. Sometimes the cost of winning is losing yourself entirely. The narrator never gets her answer. And maybe that's the point. Maybe revenge is never as satisfying as we imagine it will be. Maybe the real tragedy isn't the initial betrayal, it's what we're willing to become to punish it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever wrestled with the desire for revenge? Do you think the narrator was justified? What would you have done differently? Share your reflections in the comments below. I read every single one, and your insights matter. If this story resonated with you, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd subscribe to my newsletter or follow my work for more explorations of complex emotions, moral ambiguity, and the darker corners of human nature. New stories arrive monthly, and I promise they'll make you feel something. In the end, the person we hurt most when seeking revenge is often ourselves.